왜 나한테 이랬어?
멍청하긴.
이게 무슨 짓이야?
The hall was perfectly lit, decorated for a memorable moment, with guests wearing practiced smiles and glasses raised in anticipation. Everything seemed carefully orchestrated for a celebration of love. But a single gesture was enough to change the atmosphere. Silence cut through the music like a blade, and looks that had previously reflected joy turned to absolute shock. In the center of that social glow, a woman fell to her knees, not out of fragility, but from the force of a grief that could no longer be contained. Hours earlier, she hadn't even known she'd been invited. She'd been brought there as part of a perverse plan, as if her humiliation were a spectacle to be watched beneath glittering chandeliers. The news of the engagement was announced with pomp, smiles, and false promises, and all eyes were on her as if the mistake had been hers. The man who once swore loyalty believed he was delivering justice, guided by perfectly whispered lies. But as he toasted with his new wife at his side, he had no idea the whole thing was being recorded. Nothing there was a coincidence. Every word, every look, every calculated step was meticulously prepared by someone who loved neither him nor anyone else. A plan coldly devised, not to celebrate, but to destroy. And when the video was revealed, when the truth sank in for all to see, it was too late to turn back. But the question that echoed in the hearts of those who saw everything happen was just one. Why would someone pretend to love just to ruin someone who believed they were in control? If this revelation shocked you as much as it did them, subscribe to the channel and leave a like to follow the next chapters of this intense story. Before the scandal of that night forever tarnished Yoon Soo-Ah's reputation, there was a story marked by complicity, effort, and sacrifice that few there knew in depth. The memory of how it all began returned like a whisper in her heart, as if time, in cruel contrast, were projecting into her memory the days when she believed that with Kang Dae-Hyun's side, she could weather any storm. They met in the stuffy hallways of Seoul University when they were both just young dreamers, surrounded by books and ambitions. He had the arrogance in his eyes of someone already yearning to conquer the world, while she had the delicacy in her gestures of someone who believed in the power of silent support. Dae-Hyun came from a debt-ridden family with no resources and often considered dropping out of his business school. It was Soo-Ah who, with her unexpected strength, held his hand and promised not to let him fall, even if it meant working 2 jobs, studying through the early hours, and giving up her own dreams to support his. The years that followed were difficult, but at the same time, they forged a bond that seemed unbreakable. She prepared simple meals to save money, sewed his worn-out clothes, and still found time to encourage him when the pressures of university threatened to overwhelm him. On rainy days, they shared the same leaky umbrella, laughing at the hardships, as if believing their love could withstand any battle. When Dae-Hyun began taking his first steps into the business world, it was Soo-Ah who reviewed contracts, organized spreadsheets, and made connections, even though she had no obligation to do so. Time passed, and the dream began to take shape. The small rented office in the suburbs of Seoul transformed into a modern building in the heart of Gangnam. Kang Dae-Hyun's corporate empire was born from his ideas, but also from the sweat and silent dedication of Yoon Soo-Ah, who never demanded recognition, only the promise that they would be together through every victory. For a long time, this promise rang true. He looked at her with pride at family gatherings, publicly thanked her for her patience and, at least in words, made a point of reminding her that she was the reason for his stability. However, as the company grew and Dae-Hyun's name became synonymous with power, something also changed in his essence. The insecure, grateful young man gave way to a man intoxicated by the adulation of investors and the flattery of subordinates. Soo-Ah noticed the shifting looks in his eyes, the increasingly long silences, and understood that the distance between them was no longer just geographical, but emotional. The table once shared with simple conversations grew cold, and the laughter they shared in the wee hours disappeared, replaced by solitary dinners and vague apologies. Still, she believed it was just a phase, that the man she'd met in college still existed somewhere inside that arrogant CEO. She held firm, providing for the home, maintaining his image, and believing the storm would pass. What she didn't know was that, behind the scenes, someone had already discovered the cracks in their marriage and was preparing to turn them into deadly weapons. And it was at that moment that a new figure entered. The scene, bringing with him a charming smile and ambition hidden behind calculated gestures. It was the beginning of a dangerous game that would change everything forever. Kang Dae-Hyun's transformation from a once insecure man to a haughty, power-hungry CEO seemed complete when the company decided to hire a new marketing manager. Her name was Choi Min-Seo, and her arrival at the Kang Corporation main building was met with discreet comments and curious glances. Young, extremely articulate, and with a charm that blended innocence and boldness, Min-Seo quickly won over the halls with her persuasiveness and magnetic presence. At first, Yoon Soo-Ah didn't see the sophisticated-looking woman as a threat, believing that the trust, built over years of sacrifice, couldn't be shaken by a charming smile. However, it only took a few weeks for her to realize that Min-Seo wasn't there just for career advancement. Her gaze always sought Dae-Hyun's in meetings, her words skillfully stroked his ego, and her gestures, though discreet, were calculated to suggest closeness. Dae-Hyun, already fueled by pride and the desire to be constantly admired, began responding to stimuli almost without realizing it. He started coming home later, inventing business trips that didn't exist, and when he returned, his face glowed differently, as if he had rediscovered a vitality he no longer found in his routine with Soo-Ah. Her heart felt the separation, but her mind searched for reasons to believe it was just another reflection of the pressure of work. Min-Seo, as cunning as few, didn't limit herself to enchanting him with her presence. She understood that destroying Soo-Ah would be the quickest way to permanently take over the CEO's position. It was then that she began an even more perverse game. She presented Dae-Hyun with supposedly intercepted messages, doctored records, and even staged encounters, all carefully constructed to insinuate that Soo-Ah was involved with another man. Every detail was planned as a trap, and Dae-Hyun's every reaction brought her closer to the goal she silently pursued. The venom of suspicion began to seep into the couple's conversations. Harsh responses replaced dialogue, and the silences grew longer and longer. Soo-Ah, perplexed, couldn't understand why she was constantly accused of something she'd never done. She tried to explain herself, but every word was interpreted as an empty excuse by a husband who had already chosen who to believe. The coldness in Dae-Hyun's eyes as he watched her was a sign that the trust built over so many years was crumbling in the face of skillfully manipulated false evidence. Soo-Ah still sought the strength to save what was left, but the walls of her home were no longer a refuge, but a silent battlefield where she was always the one to blame. Meanwhile, Min-Seo watched the wear and tear with a restrained smile, knowing that soon her rival's downfall would be complete, and the moment of this fall would not be long. Incoming as a specific night marked by resentment and accusation would seal the definitive rupture between husband and wife. Nights that were once filled with awkward silence turned into confrontations filled with distrust. Yoon Soo-Ah was still trying to salvage what remained of a marriage that had begun as a shared dream, but was now gripped by accusations that cut like invisible blades. Kang Dae-Hyun, consumed by pride and Choi Min-Seo's venomous insinuations, seemed increasingly convinced that his wife had tarnished his honor. Every look, every gesture, and even the simple touch of their hands became grounds for suspicion. It was on a rainy night, when the sound of the storm mingled with Dae-Hyun's heavy breathing, that the breakup took shape. He arrived home later than usual, Min-Seo's perfume still lingering on his clothes, and found Soo-Ah waiting for him in the living room. There was concern in her eyes, but also exhaustion from so many failed attempts to explain herself. Before she could say a word, he threw an envelope full of doctored photos Min-Seo had forged onto the table. "Do you think I'm a fool?" His voice echoed like thunder inside the house. "After everything I've given you, you dare betray me?" Soo-Ah felt her legs tremble, for she no longer recognized the man before her. She tried to argue, swearing her innocence, but every word was swallowed by the wall of arrogance Dae-Hyun had erected around himself. Their conversation turned into shouting, and the shouting into insults that wounded her dignity. As tears streamed down her face, he showed no compassion, only contempt. Without allowing her to finish her defense, Dae-Hyun opened the closet and threw her clothes into makeshift suitcases. He dragged them to the door and with a brutal gesture ordered her to leave immediately. The rain fell violently and the cold wind bit Soo-Ah's face as she stood motionless before the scene, as if the reality were too difficult to comprehend. "Get your things. From now on, you're nothing but a stranger to me," he said, throwing the divorce papers at her feet. Soo-Ah slowly bent down, her hands trembling, and held up the documents confirming her expulsion not only from the house, but from the life of the man to whom she had dedicated years of love and sacrifice. Her tearful eyes met Dae-Hyun's for the last time that night, and in his cold gaze there was no room for doubt. The sentence had been passed. Without the strength to argue, she walked out onto the street with her rain-soaked belongings, her heart crushed by the weight of injustice. As the gate closed behind her with a metallic clang, Soo-Ah felt as if her entire existence had been ripped apart. The pain was so intense she could barely breathe, yet she summoned the courage to take the first step away from what she had once called home. That same night, when Dae-Hyun returned to find Min-Seo smiling contentedly in his living room, he believed he had finally freed himself from an unfaithful woman. What he didn't realize was that the real betrayal was already happening before his eyes, hidden beneath the mask of the lover who claimed to love him. As Soo-Ah disappeared into the Itaewon rain, vowing to herself not to beg for love from someone she couldn't trust, Min-Seo was already honing the next moves in her plan. And fate was preparing to show that that night of expulsion wouldn't be the end of the story, but merely the beginning of a much deeper and more devastating fall. The Itaewon rain didn't let up that night, and each drop that ran down Yoon Soo-Ah's face seemed to carry fragments of her shattered dignity. Carrying heavy, soaked suitcases, she walked aimlessly through the streets, lit by neon signs that reflected her state of abandonment. Her heart, once sustained by hope, now throbbed with the raw pain of being cast out of her own life. The public humiliation still echoed in her ears, as if every word Kang Dae-Hyun had spoken was etched into her memory. The next morning, with nowhere to go, Soo-Ah found shelter at a friend's house in Busan. The small room where she had spent her nights had become a place of silent mourning. The cold walls bore witness to her nightly tears, while the crumpled sheets held the weight of an almost unbearable loneliness. She relived in her mind every moment of her life with Dae-Hyun, from the university halls to the empire she had helped build. It all seemed like a cruel piece of irony. The man to whom she had given her best years had now cast her into oblivion, as if she were disposable. The hours dragged by in a suffocating emptiness. Soo-Ah spent her days staring at the window, watching the city's unstoppable hustle and bustle, feeling as if the world had collapsed just around her. News and business magazines featured photos of the perfect couple, Dae-Hyun and Min-Seo, side by side at luxurious dinners, smiling for the cameras as if they were the protagonists of a fairy tale. Each image was a painful blow, for while they lived in the spotlight of public adoration, she was consumed by invisibility. The weight of humiliation wasn't just social, but deeply intimate. There were nights when Soo-Ah would wake with a start, thinking she heard Dae-Hyun's voice calling her name, only to realize she was alone. At other times, she would hug old photographs, trying to draw from them the strength she no longer found within herself. Her body began to weaken, and her mind oscillated between despair and a feeble attempt to believe that one day the pain would end. Yet, within Soo-Ah's devastated heart, something remained intact, the silent flame of dignity. As shattered as she was, she couldn't allow herself to believe her life would end there. And it was amidst her bitterest tears that she made a silent, almost imperceptible decision that would change everything. She would not beg forgiveness from those who rejected her, nor would she give in to the role of victim. The world could have taken everything from her, but she still had the choice to rise again. Over the next few days, between dawn and dawn, Soo-Ah began writing in a worn notebook, stray thoughts, phrases of determination, and plans for a still uncertain future. With each word she wrote, she felt that even amidst the chaos, she was beginning to recover pieces of herself. Crying was no longer just pain, but also a process of purification that, without her realizing it, was forging a new version of who she had always been. The city of Busan, its waves crashing against the pier, seemed to whisper to her. There was life beyond the ruins. Soo-Ah didn't yet know how, but she sensed that within the silence and solitude, a force was being born that would soon transform not only her own story, but also the fate of all who had underestimated her. What she didn't imagine was that this new beginning, so discreet and silent, would soon become the turning point that no one would have dared to predict. Time in Busan seemed to flow at a different pace, and Yoon Soo-Ah discovered that silence could be both a prison and a chance for rebirth. For the first few months, she lived like a shadow, avoiding glances, refusing invitations, and sinking into a nearly invisible routine. However, it was in this very silence that she found space to reflect on every choice, every sacrifice, and every humiliation she had endured. Mourning the loss of her husband wasn't just the end of a marriage, but the crumbling of an entire life built around someone who never knew how to recognize her. Determined not to let her story end like a torn page, Soo-Ah began making small, seemingly insignificant decisions that carried the weight of a profound transformation. She rose early, walked along the shore listening to the sound of the waves, bought law books, and immersed herself in studies that rekindled an old passion. Little by little, that room, once a space for tears, transformed into a haven of discipline, where each page read represented a silent victory against the fate they tried to impose upon her. Loneliness was replaced by a routine of self-discovery. Soo-Ah enrolled at Yonsei University, returning to the academic halls no longer as the young woman supporting another man's dream, but as a woman determined to write her own story. Her nights, once filled with painful memories, were now consumed by classes, debates, and projects that made her feel alive again. At the same time, she became involved in NGOs focused on helping women who had been wronged, finding in each story of pain one more reason not to give up. The outside world remained oblivious to her transformation. For many, Yoon Soo-Ah had disappeared after her scandalous divorce, becoming just another footnote in Kang Dae-Hyun's life. However, within her, a new chapter was being born, still invisible, but full of promise. Her absence from the public eye was interpreted as weakness, but in reality, it hid a process of rebuilding that made her stronger every day. Meanwhile, in Seoul, Dae-Hyun continued to flaunt his relationship with Choi Min-Seo, convinced he had made the right choice. He didn't realize that, while he believed he was at the top of his game, his life was being monitored by watchful eyes and calculating hands. Min-Seo, with her ambition disguised as devotion, was already preparing her next steps to trap the CEO in a web from which he would be unable to escape. And it would be precisely this. Contrast between Soo-Ah's silence and Dae-Hyun's false rise that would open the doors to the most unexpected twist of all. In Seoul, Kang Dae-Hyun's glory days seemed endless. Business magazines featured his smiling image alongside Choi Min-Seo, society columns extolled the new couple, and foreign investors applauded him as a visionary capable of turning every opportunity into gold. What no one knew was that behind every applause, Min-Seo concealed a discreet camera and a sharp mind that meticulously recorded the missteps of the man who believed he had the world at his feet. Dae-Hyun's drunken nights at private celebrations were secretly filmed. Every untimely word turned into a fragment of evidence, and every thoughtless decision became part of a silently growing archive. Min-Seo took his time, understanding that a giant's downfall doesn't happen with one push, but with subtle blows that, accumulated, inevitably bring him down. Meanwhile, Kang Corporation's business dealings were beginning to show small cracks. Strategic partnerships were shaken by rumors of corruption. Important contracts were cut short after meetings in which Dae-Hyun appeared too arrogant to negotiate, and even within the boardroom, murmurs of dissatisfaction arose. What seemed like a passing phase soon became a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The once absolute trust began to crumble into murmurs in the hallways. The ironic thing was that Dae-Hyun, blinded by his own pride, didn't realize that many of these rumors originated within his own home. Min-Seo, skilled at manipulating both the press and social media, leaked carefully chosen excerpts from recordings that placed him in compromising situations. Anonymous news stories emerged like waves, revealing personal misdeeds and financial suspicions. The CEO, despite trying to maintain his composure, began to feel the pressure at every investor meeting. Tension also seeped into their relationship. Min-Seo's sweet smile remained, but her eyes betrayed a growing coldness. She, who had once seemed completely devoted to him, now treated him like a pawn on a larger board. Dae-Hyun, accustomed to being the player, didn't realize he was merely a carefully controlled piece. As his empire began to falter, in Busan, Soo-Ah consolidated her new trajectory. Her law school graduation was discreet but charged with meaning, representing not just a title, but a victory against all who considered her defeated. The hallways that had once witnessed her tears now echoed her firm footsteps, and each case she defended for NGOs reinforced her image as a resilient and committed woman. The contrast between the two worlds could not have been greater. While he slowly sank into his own arrogance, she silently emerged with a strength no one dared predict. The newspapers, always eager for scandal, began to notice the change in tone. While they had previously extolled the image of the CEO and his mistress, they now discreetly published the first suspicions: failures in the management of Kang Corporation, shaky partnerships, signs of instability in Dae-Hyun's empire. The questions emerged like seeds that would soon germinate into widespread distrust. Min-Seo watched everything with almost cruel calm, knowing the moment of the final blow had not yet arrived. Every step taken was part of a meticulously written plot, and the higher Dae-Hyun believed himself to be, the more painful the fall would be. And as his pride turned to blindness, an unexpected reunion approached, ready to turn his world upside down. Autumn in Seoul brought with it a crisp air that blanketed the streets with golden leaves and the solemn atmosphere of international conferences held at the modern Gangnam Convention Center. It was there that corporate leaders, renowned lawyers and investors from around the world gathered, seeking ideas that would define the future of the Asian market. Kang Dae-Hyun, still trying to maintain his poise as a top executive, despite the growing rumors that were eroding his image, was invited to represent Kang Corporation before thousands of attentive gazes. He wore an impeccable suit, tailored to exude confidence, but in his eyes there was a shadow of insecurity that persisted. As he walked down the central aisle, surrounded by cameras and flashes, he believed this would be his opportunity to reassert his authority, to show the world that he was still the same admired visionary. However, his heart sank when he heard the announcement echo through the main auditorium. The next speaker would be the lawyer, Yoon Soo-Ah, a corporate ethics expert and guest of honor at the event. The name, like an unexpected blow, froze her blood. The door opened, and before everyone, Soo-Ah emerged in an elegant, sober-colored dress, radiating confidence with every step. There was no trace of the humiliated woman who had been driven out into the rain. In her place was someone who had risen from the ashes, with the serenity in her eyes of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. Silence filled the auditorium for a few seconds until it was broken by applause that echoed like thunder, honoring the lawyer who represented the new generation of ethical and relentless professionals. Dae-Hyun stood motionless, his breath catching as he watched the woman he believed he had destroyed rise before them all with unwavering strength. His face maintained its composure, but his sweaty palms and racing heart revealed the storm raging within him. Soo-Ah's speech, firm and eloquent, addressed the importance of transparency, justice, and integrity, each word sounding like an indirect indictment of the man who once shared his life. Choi Min-Seo, sitting next to other executives, watched the scene intently. A small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, not out of admiration for Soo-Ah, but confirmation that the game was more exciting than she'd imagined. She understood that this reunion was no mere coincidence. It was the beginning of the cruelest part of her plot. For Dae-Hyun, however, every minute of that speech was a plunge into memories he'd rather forget. The woman he'd driven away had returned not as a victim, but as a witness to his own decline and a symbol of his own blindness. And when Soo-Ah's gaze met his, for a moment that felt eternal, it was clear that the story between them was far from over. Ever since that conference in Gangnam, the image of Yoon Soo-Ah had been on Kang Dae-Hyun's mind. Every night in his luxurious penthouse, he remembered her steady gaze across the auditorium and felt a mixture of regret and a desire to reclaim what, out of pride, he had thrown away. For the first time in many years, he realized that nothing he had built alongside Choi Min-Seo filled the void growing within him. Power no longer held the same flavor, contracts seemed fragile, and even applause sounded hollow compared to the silence of the woman who had never spoken a word to him. That's how the attempts at rapprochement began. At first, discreet. A bouquet of flowers delivered to the door of Soo-Ah's new office, accompanied by a poorly written note apologizing. Then, long, desperate messages on her cell phone, which remained unanswered. When her silence became unbearable, Dae-Hyun summoned courage and showed up at her house in Busan, wearing the mask of regret he believed would be enough to break any resistance. "So, I messed up," he said, his voice breaking, his eyes brimming with tears. "I was blind. I let myself be led astray by lies. Please, just give me one chance to make things right." She listened to him in silence, but her eyes held no hatred, only a firm serenity that revealed how much she had already overcome. When she answered, her voice was low, but each word sounded like a sentence. "You believed her because it was easier than trusting me. There's nothing to fix, Dae-Hyun. What we had died the day you threw me out in that Rain. The rejection hit him like an invisible blow. He tried to insist, tried to reminisce about his youth, even tried to blame his own blindness. But Soo-Ah was unfazed. For her, the pain had already turned into a lesson, and the love she once held for him was now just a distant memory. Meanwhile, Min-Seo watched his desperation from afar with a calculating gaze. She knew that Dae-Hyun's emotional weakness would be the key to accelerating his destruction, and she watched him crawl in search of something he would never have again. The powerful man who had once believed he controlled everything was about to become a hostage to his own choices. And it would be precisely in this vulnerability that the final blow would be struck, revealing to the entire world that behind the veil of glory there was only one man about to be exposed in his most devastating ruin. The conference had been merely the prelude to something much greater. Without realizing it, Kang Dae-Hyun was already walking into a trap woven with patience and precision. Choi Min-Seo, the woman he believed to be proof of his victory, had in fact been collecting the pieces of his downfall. Every secret meeting, every careless phone call, every rash word spoken on nights of euphoria or anger had been recorded. And these weren't just trivial records, but documents that exposed corruption, shady contracts, and even intimate moments that would destroy his image in the eyes of all Korea. However, Min-Seo knew that destroying the man in private wasn't enough. The entire world needed to witness his downfall. That's why he chose a grand stage, the annual Business Awards ceremony, broadcast live on the country's major broadcasters. That night, politicians, corporate leaders, and Seoul's elite would gather to honor what they called the Generation of Titans. Dae-Hyun believed he would be crowned once again, that his name would be exalted as synonymous with success. Min-Seo, however, had already prepared the spectacle of humiliation. The room was packed with cameras, flashes illuminating every detail, and the atmosphere oozed luxury. When Dae-Hyun took the stage to accept the Businessman of the Year award, he lifted the trophy with the same pride as always, certain he was still adored. Then the lights dimmed, and the giant screen behind him began to display unexpected images. At first, seemingly harmless videos, private meetings, exclusive parties, dinners with politicians. But soon, the content turned devastating. Audio snippets revealed bribes, illegal contracts, and financial manipulations. Then, the footage showed moments of explicit contempt for Soo-Ah, cruel insults, and even arrogant statements about how he would never need her to reach the top. Silence fell over the audience. Journalists in disbelief hurriedly stood to record every second. Politicians whispered nervously. Businessmen hid their faces with their hands. Dae-Hyun, paralyzed, tried to deny it with his expression. But each new recording felt like a blow to his credibility. And at the back of the hall, barely visible, Min-Seo watched the scene with the calm of someone finally seeing their plot take shape. The next few minutes seemed to stretch on forever. The audience, once reverent, now regarded him with contempt. The embarrassing master of ceremonies tried to stop the screening, but Min-Seo assured him there would be no stopping. The screens even showed the night of the party, where he ripped off Soo-Ah's wedding ring in front of the executives, a cruel recording that exposed not only his arrogance, but also the public humiliation that had triggered his downfall. Dae-Hyun felt his legs weaken. The trophy slipped from his hands and fell to the floor, producing a metallic crash that echoed throughout the hall, symbolizing his downfall. The press was already broadcasting the images live to millions of viewers. The empire of glory he believed indestructible was crumbling before his eyes, on national television, with no way back. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Social media exploded with comments, hashtags took over digital platforms, and within hours, Kang Dae-Hyun went from being a business titan to a pariah. a target of public scorn. Investors cancelled contracts, partners broke off alliances, and the company's own board met hurriedly to remove him as CEO. However, the most painful blow was not delivered by Min-Seo, but by Soo-Ah's silent presence. Seated among the guests of honor, she didn't need to say a single word. The simple fact that she was there, intact and serene, contrasted with the image of a broken man on stage. Dae-Hyun saw her from afar, and in that instant, he understood that true justice wasn't just losing everything, but watching the rise of the woman he'd underestimated, and as the room dissolved into murmurs, a chill ran down her spine. Because this would not only be a night of public humiliation, but the beginning of an even darker descent, where her own conscience would become her worst prison. The streets of Myeongdong were wet with a light rain that reflected the colorful lights of the shop windows, but for Kang Dae-Hyun, nothing seemed to shine. The man once revered as a business titan walked aimlessly, his overcoat soaked, and the empty expression of someone who had lost not only the empire he built, but also every shred of dignity. Each step echoed like a cruel reminder that his downfall had been broadcast in front of millions, and now there was nowhere to hide from the collective scorn. Memories haunted him like persistent ghosts. He remembered his first day at university when Yoon Soo-Ah had held his hand and told him they would walk together until the end. He remembered the nights she'd skimped on dinner so he could buy books, and the way she'd smile even when exhaustion had consumed her. The contrast with the night he'd driven her out into the storm was unbearable. The scene returned in vivid detail, her teary eyes, the sound of the door closing, and the cruel certainty he'd proclaimed without even hearing her. Now, gazing at his distorted reflection in a shop window, he saw not a leader, but a broken man, consumed by regret. His mind wandered through the corridors of the company that no longer belonged to him, imagining the directors signing documents that removed him from the presidency, while investors treated him like dead weight. The power he had believed eternal had dissolved into humiliation, and the image he had so cherished had become a laughingstock. Most painful, however, was the memory of Soo-Ah's serene presence at the ceremony where his downfall was broadcast live. She didn't need to retaliate with words. Her simple existence, firm and unwavering, was enough to remind him that he had lost what could never be recovered. Dae-Hyun felt that the true punishment lay not in financial ruin, but in her silence, a silence filled with a dignity that crushed him more than any accusation. He walked to a quiet square where he sat on a stone bench, ignored by the hurried passers-by. The city seemed indifferent to his personal tragedy, and this indifference was another blow to his vanity. For the first time, he realized that he was not irreplaceable, that the world did not stop for his pain, and that his arrogance had made him a prisoner of himself. As the rain continued to fall, Dae-Hyun lifted his face to the cloudy sky and for the first time allowed himself to cry in public. Tears mingled with the cold, dripping water, but no one cared. The man who believed he dominated the board game was now just another lost soul in the crowd. And yet, somewhere in that same city, Soo-Ah was preparing to take the final step that would close the cycle of her story, showing that destiny had even more in store for those who believed that everything was under control. The morning sun slowly rose over Seoul, illuminating the skyscrapers that symbolized power and conquest, but which now no longer belonged to Kang Dae-Hyun. In the city's financial heart, a packed auditorium awaited the announcement of a new era for Kang Corporation, and among those present was a figure whose presence commanded both respect and admiration, Yoon Soo-Ah. She walked to the center of the stage with firm steps, wearing an elegant dark ensemble that reflected her posture as a transformed woman, someone who no longer carried the weight of humiliation, but the lightness of someone who had learned to rebuild. Herself, executives, journalists, and investors watched intently, aware that they were witnessing a historic moment. The woman who had been discarded on a stormy night now returned not only as a survivor, but as a protagonist. Soo-Ah calmly signed the documents formalizing her acquisition of the majority of the shares, becoming the new president of the company she had quietly helped build, but from which she had been cruelly expelled. The pen glided smoothly across the paper, but each stroke carried the strength of years of pain, perseverance, and dignity. As the flashes illuminated her serene face, she smiled discreetly. It wasn't a smile of revenge, but of intimate victory, of the certainty that no act of contempt could erase the value of a life guided by integrity. Around her, the audience gave a standing ovation, recognizing not just a leader, but a woman who had transformed her own story into an example of resilience. The scene was symbolic. Dae-Hyun's downfall was not just the end of a powerful man, but a reflection that arrogance never triumphs over truth. Dae-Hyun, for his part, watched from afar. He wasn't in the auditorium as he no longer had the right to occupy that space. He watched on television from a small hotel room, his expression weary and his eyes teary. He saw Soo-Ah look up at the investors and declare in a firm voice that from then on, the company would be guided by principles of ethics, transparency, and human respect. That phrase echoed within him as a painful reminder of everything he had lost, not only in business, but in love, trust, and dignity. At the end of the ceremony, Soo-Ah walked to the exit amidst a storm of applause. The entire city seemed to rejoice at her triumph, and in her heart there was only peace. She wasn't seeking to destroy Dae-Hyun, for she understood that life had already taught him the hardest lesson of all, realizing that the game board was never in his hands. As she got into her car, she looked up at the sky and took a deep breath, as if finally closing a circle. And so the story of an unjustly treated woman became a powerful testament to strength and resilience, proving that no lie stands the test of time and that dignity always finds a way to shine, even after the darkest nights. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel now. We have many other intense and surprising narratives that will captivate you from beginning to end. Turn on the bell so you don't miss the next chapters, and share this video with someone who needs inspiration from this journey of pain, courage, and redemption.